They laughed when he entered the gym, old sneakers, faded hoodie, mop bucket in hand. Not a fighter, not a threat, just the help. "Hey, janitor," the coach smirked. "How about you show us a move or two for fun?" The room chuckled. He didn't. He looked at the mat, then at his hands. Hands that once shattered ribs in Vegas. Hands that once cradled a dying friend in Tokyo. He hadn't fought in 20 years, not since the day silence became his punishment, but that night, silence became his weapon. He didn't raise his voice, he raised the standard, and when he finally stepped onto that mat, he didn't just teach them how to fight, he taught them why you never, ever judge the man holding the mop. He didn't belong there, at least that's what they thought. A black man in his 40s, too quiet, too polite. He never looked anyone in the eye for too long, never interrupted, never explained himself, just swept the mats, emptied the trash, and disappeared before the last light flickered out. They called him Marcus. Some didn't bother remembering his name. To them, he was just the guy who worked nights, the guy who stayed out of the way, the guy who had nothing to do with real fighters. But they didn't know. They didn't know that every time Marcus watched around from the corner of the gym, he wasn't curious. He was remembering. They didn't know that the way he moved, quiet, precise, steady, wasn't from years of janitorial work, but from decades of war on canvas and blood on gloves. He wasn't born a cleaner, he chose to be one, after he chose never to fight again. Not after what happened in Tokyo, not after the screams, not after the silence. But fate's funny like that. You spend years trying to disappear, and one cocky voice can drag your entire past back into the room. "Hey, old man, want to spar for fun?" There it was, the sound of ego, the scent of disrespect. And in that moment, Marcus didn't hear the laughter. He heard the bell, not the one hanging above the gym door, but the one inside his soul. The bell that rang not for violence, but for something far more dangerous, justice. It started with a laugh, not a real one, not the kind that fills a room with joy, the other kind, the kind that stings. Brandon Cole stood in the center of the mat, black belt tight, confidence tighter, the kind of man who mistook sarcasm for strength, the kind who thought respect was earned by volume. He pointed with his chin toward Marcus, who was quietly wringing out a mop near the exit. "You," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Got any tips for us, Sensei Mop?" A few students chuckled, some didn't. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was the kind that hums in the chest when something's about to go wrong. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He pressed the mop down once more. Methodical, like every movement meant something. Brandon tilted his head, amused. "Come on, man," he pushed. "Don't be shy. You've seen enough classes. You must have picked up something by now, right?" Still no answer. One of the younger students, a teenager with braces and nervous hands, glanced at Marcus, then back at Brandon. "Coach," he said quietly, "maybe we should just—" "Nope," Brandon cut in, loud and sharp. "This is a teachable moment." He strutted across the mat like a game show host, arms wide, smiling big. "Everyone here trains to protect themselves, to stand their ground, to know who they are when challenged. And sometimes a challenge comes from the unexpected." He turned back toward Marcus. "So, janitor," he said, dragging out the word, "how about you step onto the mat, just for fun? No ego, no pressure, just a demonstration." This time, Marcus looked up, slowly, like a man turning a page he swore he'd never read again. His eyes didn't burn, they didn't challenge, they just saw. And in that one glance, Brandon took an involuntary step back, just half an inch, but enough. Marcus set the mop back into the bucket, then straightened his back. The movement was small, subtle even, but something in the room shifted. It felt like when the wind drops suddenly right before a thunderstorm. Brandon laughed. Too loud, too quick. "You see that?" he said to the students. "Body language. That's fear loosening up the joints." No one laughed this time. Marcus stepped forward once. His shoes barely made a sound on the mat. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "But when we're done, you apologize to every person in this room for turning a place of learning into your personal circus." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even stern. It was calm, like still water before the ripples. Brandon waved him on, still smiling. "Sure thing, old man. I'll apologize when I scrape you off the mat." From the back, Lena Torres stood frozen. She'd seen hundreds of sparring matches. She'd been training jiu-jitsu since college. But something about this didn't feel like a match. It felt like the start of something else. Something buried, something alive. Marcus stepped fully onto the mat. No stance, no fists, just presence. Brandon bounced on his toes, showboating for the students. "You're about to see why belts matter," he shouted. "Why hierarchy exists, why experience always wins." But the longer Marcus stood there, still calm, watching, the more Brandon began to sweat. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't intimidation. It was the absence of fear, like trying to shout into a canyon and realizing the echo doesn't come back. From the sidelines, Lena opened the Notes app on her phone. She didn't know what was about to happen, but something told her. She'd want to remember every second of it. The moment his foot touched the center mat, Marcus wasn't a janitor anymore. He didn't puff his chest, didn't raise his fists, didn't shout. He just stood, as if the room itself needed a second to understand what was happening. Brandon couldn't read it. He kept moving, kept talking, because that's what insecure men do when the silence gets too loud. "Y'all see this, right?" Brandon turned to his students. "He's stiff, flat-footed, probably doesn't even know how to block." Lena wasn't buying it. She didn't know why, but her pulse was quickening. Something about Marcus's posture. It wasn't ignorance. It was patience. He looked like a man who'd seen storms that hadn't even made the forecast yet. "Okay," Brandon said, cracking his neck. "I'll go easy." He stepped forward, hands up, jab position. Marcus didn't flinch. "Come on," Brandon prodded. "Let's give him a show." But Marcus didn't move like a showman. He didn't move at all. That's what made it worse. Brandon launched the first jab. It cut through the air where Marcus's head had been. But Marcus had already shifted barely like a shadow adjusting to light. No block, no counter, just not there. Brandon blinked. That didn't make sense. He tried again. Jab, jab, cross, all clean, all fast, and everyone missed. This time some of the students noticed. The teenager with braces leaned forward. Lena narrowed her eyes. Even the guy leaning on the back wall stopped chewing his gum. "What the?" Brandon muttered. He shook out his arms, stepped back, reset. But Marcus wasn't resetting. He hadn't even started. He stood in the same loose stance. Hands down, shoulders level, breathing steady. Brandon moved in again, this time with a feint and a quick hook to the body. He was fast, clean, textbook, but Marcus leaned. Not dodged, just leaned, like gravity had been waiting for the punch. The fist cut through open air. Brandon stumbled slightly from his own momentum. Marcus didn't say a word, just watched, measured. Brandon spun, frustrated now. Stop dancing, fight. Still nothing from Marcus. That's when the students began to shift. Their coach, the man they'd admired, was starting to look desperate, and the janitor, he hadn't even raised his hands yet. Lena opened a browser on her phone, searched. Marcus Reed MMA. Nothing. She tried Marcus Reed, martial arts, Denver, still nothing. But something told her she wasn't crazy. This wasn't beginner's luck. This was memory, reflexes baked in blood, sweat, and something deeper. Brandon attacked again. This time, a full combo, jab, cross, hook, roundhouse. Every single strike sliced air, and when Brandon came back to center, Marcus was standing closer than before. How? Brandon stepped back instinctively, and that, right there, was the moment everything changed. A black belt stepping away from a janitor. The air shifted. The students went quiet. The room wasn't a classroom anymore. It was a courtroom. Marcus finally spoke. Problem? His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like a gavel. Brandon clenched his jaw. No problem, he muttered. Just admiring your footwork. No one laughed. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, and Brandon backed up again. Now it was visible, obvious. The black belt was on the run. The students saw it. Lena definitely saw it. She leaned over to the student next to her. He's not new, she whispered. Look at his weight transfer, his stance. He's someone. Back on the mat, Brandon was trying to salvage his ego. "You been watching YouTube tutorials, huh?" he said, fake grin cracking. Marcus smiled for the first time, but it wasn't amusement. It was memory. "I learned from somewhere a little harder than that," he said. Brandon scoffed. "Oh yeah, like where?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lena typed in one last search. Las Vegas National Gym Silent Stormfighter retired. And then she froze, because staring back at her was a black and white photo from a Sports Illustrated cover, 20 years old. A younger man. Same eyes. Same quiet presence. Marcus Silent Storm Reed. 5X World MMA champion. Undefeated. Retired after a freak accident that ended his partner's life. And just like that, Lena understood. This wasn't a janitor with good reflexes. This was a ghost in exile, and tonight, he had come home. Brandon's face said it all. He'd felt it now. Not just the movement, but the presence. The kind that doesn't come from belts or trophies or gym hours. The kind that comes from war, from surviving something that should have broken you. He started circling Marcus again, trying to regain control. "You're good," he muttered. "I'll give you that. But I've sparred with champions too." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not here to impress you." Brandon chuckled nervously. "Right, you're just here to clean the mats." The students watched, silent. The energy had shifted. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore. It was something older, deeper. Every move Marcus made was like a memory returning to muscle. He didn't attack. He didn't taunt. He reflected, and that was what made Brandon spiral. Because when a man refuses to meet your ego, you're left fighting your own reflection. Brandon tried again. A low kick, a spinning back fist, something flashy, but Marcus stepped inside it with no effort, shoulder brushing past Brandon's strike like they were dancing, a ghost in motion. Then he stopped, right in front of Brandon, close enough for breath to meet breath, and said, "Still want to continue?" Brandon's jaw tightened. He swung, desperation this time, a hard right. Marcus leaned back, just enough. The punch missed by inches. He caught Brandon's wrist, not yanked, not twisted, just held. And in that single moment, Brandon froze, because somehow that grip didn't feel like skin. It felt like truth. Marcus looked into his eyes. "You ever lose someone?" he asked quietly. Brandon blinked, caught off guard. What?" "Someone you couldn't protect, because your pride got in the way." The room was dead silent. Even Lena felt her throat tighten. Marcus let go, took a step back, and for the first time invited the attack. Brandon screamed and charged. The moment his foot lifted, Marcus moved, but not with power. With precision, he slid to the side, used Brandon's momentum against him, a shift of the hip, a subtle angle, and suddenly Brandon was off the ground. He hit the mat hard, not brutal, just final, a soft thud, the kind that humbles, not harms. Marcus stood over him. No anger, no triumph, just a question. "Now do you see?" Brandon groaned, rolling onto his side, sweat dripping, ego shattered. Who are you?" Marcus knelt. "I was a fighter once. I became a ghost. Now I'm just a man who remembers what it means to stand for something." He stood up and offered his hand, but Brandon didn't take it. He sat there, broken, breathing heavy, and for the first time in years, listening. Lena couldn't stay still anymore. She walked slowly onto the mat, her voice calm but steady. "Mr. Reed," he turned to her, eyes soft. "You're Silent Storm, aren't you?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lena looked around at the students. "This is what real martial arts looks like," she said. "Not dominance, not performance, but balance." Brandon looked up at her, ashamed. Lena didn't mock him. She just said, "Sensei Cole, it's okay to be wrong, but it's not okay to stay that way." Back near the wall, the teenager with braces whispered to the girl next to him, "I'll never look at janitors the same again." She nodded. "Or fighters." Marcus picked up his mop, walked back toward the corner, but this time, every pair of eyes followed him, not because they feared him, but because they finally saw him. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat alone in his one-bedroom apartment, lights off, TV on mute. Old fights played on the screen in black and white footage, not the ones with him in them, the ones before him, the legends, the real ones, the men who knew how to win and still chose mercy. He watched them move, measured, calm, controlled, and then he saw himself, not literally, but in the flicker of one man's slip, the way he checked a kick without shifting his weight. It was a move Marcus hadn't practiced in 20 years, yet his body still remembered it. He turned off the TV. Silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that held names, voices, regret. He looked at the small photograph taped to the side of his fridge. 2 men, sweaty, laughing. One of them, young Marcus, the other, Devin Hayes. Devin's smile could light up an arena. He was fast, flashy, brave, and now he was just a memory, a name no one in that gym had ever heard. Because Marcus never spoke of that night, Tokyo 2003, it was just a sparring match, nothing serious, just routine. But Devin dropped his guard, and Marcus, he didn't pull the punch. It landed too clean, too hard, too fast. Devin's head hit the mat at the wrong angle. He never woke up. The commission ruled it an accident, but Marcus didn't need a ruling. He knew. It was pride, pressure, proving something that didn't need to be proved. And ever since, every time he raised his hands, they felt heavier. So he stopped. Not just fighting, living. He disappeared into jobs no one noticed. Graveyard shifts, maintenance gigs, places where silence was respected more than talent. He thought he could bury it, that part of himself. But the cage never lets you go. It just waits until someone pokes it again. The next morning he showed up to the gym as usual, mop in hand, hoodie up. No one said a word, not even Brandon. The whole room felt different, like they were all pretending yesterday didn't happen. But everyone remembered, especially Lena. She watched Marcus closely from the corner of her eye, not intrusively, respectfully. She'd spent the night reading everything she could find. Silent Storm, the man who vanished, a fighter once known not for his trash talk, but for the silence between his strikes, the pause that preceded punishment. She closed her notebook, walked up to him. "Morning, Mr. Reed." He nodded. "Morning." She hesitated, then said, I wanted to say thank you. He paused. For what? For showing us what control really looks like, what strength really is. Marcus smiled gently. You don't have to thank me. Just don't forget. Brandon stood in the back of the gym, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken since the incident. He kept to himself. Drilled basics with the lower belts. But he wasn't mocking anymore. He wasn't loud. The silence had reached him too. At the end of class, he approached Marcus, his voice low, tight. I looked you up. Marcus nodded. I figured. Brandon sighed. I had no idea. If I had known. Marcus cut him off, soft but firm. Would you have treated me any different? Brandon blinked. Probably. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's the problem. Brandon looked down. I'm sorry, he said. I thought being in charge meant never showing weakness. Marcus shook his head. Being in charge means knowing when to be humble. He picked up his mop again, same as always. But this time, the room watched him with new eyes. Not because he moved like a warrior, but because he walked like a man who'd been broken, and still chose to stand tall. Later that night, Lena wrote in her journal, Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just cleans the floor and waits for you to pay attention. The next week, Marcus kept his routine. Same faded hoodie, same silent mop, same quiet nod to whoever made eye contact, which wasn't many. But something had shifted in the gym, not in volume, not in rules, in energy. Respect didn't shout anymore, it listened, especially Lena. She watched Marcus the way a musician watches a master pianist, not for the performance, but for the pauses in between. And the students, they weren't sure what to say to him. Some offered awkward hellos. Others lowered their voices when he walked past. But Marcus didn't demand reverence. He wasn't a symbol. He was a man who carried silence like a sword. That Tuesday, a new kid joined class. 16, skinny, nervous. Name was Isaiah. Brandon introduced him, then left him with the group. Isaiah looked lost. His GI was too big, his belt tied like a shoelace, and his eyes, they darted, searching for safety. He didn't find it. During drills, the older students moved too fast for him. One even laughed when Isaiah fell trying to shrimp out of a guard. No one helped. Not until Marcus stepped onto the edge of the mat. He didn't say anything, just crouched beside Isaiah and showed him how to tie the belt, slowly, patiently, then whispered, Fast comes later. First be steady. Isaiah nodded, eyes wide, like someone had handed him permission to not be perfect. Lena saw it all. She walked over after class, still sweaty, still breathing heavy. You teach better without saying much, she said. Marcus chuckled softly. Most people talk too much to hear what their body's really saying. She nodded. Brandon's changing, she added. I think he's trying. Marcus looked toward Brandon, who was correcting a student's stance without yelling. Trying's a start, Marcus said. Later that night, Lena stayed behind. The gym was empty except for Marcus mopping the back corner. She stepped onto the mat, barefoot. I wanted to ask you something, she said. Marcus didn't stop mopping. Ask. She hesitated. Why did you stop fighting? Marcus paused, then wrung out the mop. Because I forgot what I was fighting for. Lena waited. She knew better than to rush the silence. Marcus leaned on the mop handle. There was a time I fought to prove something, to the world, to myself. But when I finally had it all, I lost someone who mattered more. He didn't say Devin's name. He didn't have to. Lena swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Marcus nodded. That's why I clean floors now. It keeps me grounded, reminds me not to chase noise. She looked around the gym at the echoing stillness. This place is quieter when you're here. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Quieter or more focused? She smiled. Both. Before she left, Lena turned and said, "Would you ever teach again?" Marcus looked at her, not with surprise, with consideration. "I'm not a coach." "Not asking you to be," she said. "I'm asking if you'd share what you know." Marcus didn't answer, but he didn't say no. The next morning, Brandon added a new name to the instructor schedule. Special session, philosophy and flow with Marcus R. No belts, no forms, just breath, presence, and silence. The gym smelled different that morning, not of sweat or bleach, but of something rarer, expectation. The whiteboard near the front desk read, 10 a.m., Flow and Philosophy, Instructor Marcus R. No belt required, no sign-up sheet, no fee, just an invitation. And surprisingly, people came. A few black belts, some curious beginners. Even Brandon standing in the back, arms crossed but watching. Marcus didn't enter dramatically. He walked in the same way he always did, hood up, head down, mop set aside. But this time he stepped onto the mat not to clean it, but to teach on it. He looked around at the group, then said, "We're not sparring today. We're remembering." That got a few confused looks. Marcus continued. "Most people think fighting starts with fists. It doesn't. It starts with breath, with listening, with knowing where you are before you decide where to go." He walked through the line of students slowly. No shouting, no striking, just flow. They began with slow drills, movement without resistance, step, shift, breathe. At first, some students fumbled, especially the younger ones, but Marcus guided them, not with instructions, with example. He moved like time didn't touch him, like the air respected him too much to resist. Even Lena, who had trained for years, felt her body slow down, then align in a way it never had before. It wasn't just technique, it was something deeper. But then it happened. One of the students, Eli, a former amateur boxer, decided to test him. Mid-flow, he threw a real punch. Not hard, but fast, enough to rattle most people. Marcus didn't blink. He stepped inside the punch and tapped Eli's chest with 2 fingers. Eli stumbled backward, not from force, from shock. "Why'd you do that?" Marcus asked gently. Eli looked down, embarrassed. I just wanted to see if it was real." Marcus nodded. "Now you know, but let me ask you something. Did you learn more from the tap or from the punch?" Eli thought about it. "The tap." Marcus smiled. "Exactly." He turned back to the group. "Power isn't about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do." After class, the students stayed longer than usual. Some stretched. Others asked quiet questions. Brandon approached slowly. "Where'd you learn that last move?" he asked. Marcus looked at him. "Tokyo." Brandon swallowed hard. "You ever miss it?" Marcus paused. "Sometimes I miss who I was in the ring, but not who I became outside of it." Brandon nodded. "I get that." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Brandon chuckled. "Ego's a hell of a drug." Marcus smiled. "That's the first honest thing I've heard you say since I got here." Brandon laughed, genuinely this time. "Fair." Later that day, Marcus sat alone in the locker room. Lena knocked on the doorframe. "Hey," he looked up. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "just remembering." She sat beside him on the bench. "What is it about flow that matters so much to you?" Marcus leaned back, hands on his knees. "Because when I forgot how to flow, I forgot how to feel." He looked at her. "I got good at hurting people, even when I didn't mean to." Lena nodded quietly. "And now?" Marcus exhaled. Now I'm trying to get good at healing them. That evening, the gym was dark. Only Marcus remained, alone, barefoot on the mat. He stood still, closed his eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, he bowed, not to the room, to the man he used to be. The following week, word had spread. Marcus's flow class wasn't just different, it was redefining the gym. Students were moving slower, thinking more. Conversations were quieter but deeper. Even Brandon, once a walking megaphone, had shifted. He still ran his classes, but now there were moments of pause, of reflection. But peace doesn't last long in places built on competition, and the challenge came from outside. Friday afternoon, a man walked through the doors, taller than Brandon, younger than Marcus, covered in tattoos and loud confidence. Name was Clay Maddox, former Muay Thai pro now coaching at a rival gym across town. He'd heard stories about a janitor teaching philosophy and breathing. He didn't like that, because guys like Clay don't believe in softness. They believe in hierarchy and dominance. He stood at the front desk and smirked. Is this the place where the janitor teaches fighters how to breathe? No one answered. Marcus was across the room, setting up for class. Clay's voice rose. Hey, old man, I'm talking to you. Marcus looked up slowly. Brandon stepped forward. Clay, not here, man. This ain't the place. Clay shrugged him off. Oh, relax. I just want to see if Sensei Mop can handle a real fight. A few students froze. Lena stood from her stretch, her eyes locked on Marcus. He didn't react. He walked toward Clay, calm, controlled. You looking to learn something? He asked softly. Clay smirked. Looking to teach something. Marcus nodded. Then step onto the mat. No shoes, no yelling, just movement. Clay kicked off his sneakers and stomped barefoot onto the mat. No bow, no respect, just fists. Marcus faced him. No stance, just stillness. Start when you're ready, Marcus said. Clay didn't wait. He lunged. A sharp elbow meant to end it quick. Marcus ducked under, pivoted, and placed 2 fingers lightly on Clay's back. Clay stumbled forward, off balance. You falling or flying? Marcus asked. Clay growled. Swung again. This time a leg kick, brutal and fast. But Marcus caught it, held it for half a second, then gently placed it back on the mat. The room was silent. Clay was sweating. You think you're better than me? He spat. Marcus looked him in the eye. No, I think you don't know who you are without violence. Clay screamed and launched a haymaker. It never landed. Marcus slipped to the inside, palm to chest, and Clay went down. Not from power, from precision. A controlled fall, no injury, but complete domination. The room didn't cheer, they breathed. A collective inhale. Marcus stood over Clay, calm as always. You came here to teach, he said. Now listen. Clay stared up, humiliated. You fight hard, Marcus said, but you fight scared. He offered a hand. Clay slapped it away, then stormed out. Brandon exhaled slowly. You handled that better than I ever could. Marcus turned to him. It's not about handling them. It's about not becoming them. Lena approached. What just happened? She asked. Marcus looked around the room. The same thing that happens in every dojo at some point. A belt falls off, and the truth gets revealed. That night, Marcus found an old box under his bed. Inside, his championship belt, dusty, heavy. He held it in both hands, then quietly placed it back inside. He didn't need it anymore. Some lessons echo louder in silence. After the incident with Clay Maddox, the gym became quieter, but not out of fear. It was awareness, the kind that settles in when a room realizes it's been sleepwalking for years and just woke up. Students moved with more intention. They didn't ask for more rounds. They asked better questions. Brandon stopped coaching from volume. He started coaching from observation. And Marcus? He taught less, but every word mattered more. One day, Isaiah, the skinny kid, stayed after class. He stood awkwardly in front of Marcus, fidgeting with the hem of his GI. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Marcus nodded. "Why don't you wear your belt?" Marcus looked down at the plain black hoodie he always wore over his GI pants. "Because I don't need to prove anything." Isaiah frowned. "But you earned it." Marcus smiled. "Then it doesn't need to be seen to exist." He leaned forward. "People wear belts to show who they are, but sometimes the ones who stop wearing them are the ones who finally figured it out." That night, Lena stayed behind. She'd been training harder, not for belts, for clarity. She found Marcus sitting alone near the locker room mirror. He wasn't looking at his reflection, just sitting in front of it, like he was waiting for something to speak back. "You okay?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Depends what you mean by okay." She sat beside him. "The mirror's a hard place," she said softly. Marcus finally met her eyes. "It doesn't lie." He paused. "But sometimes it takes 20 years before you're brave enough to look." Lena said nothing. She didn't have to. They sat in that quiet for a while. Then Marcus spoke again. "I used to love fighting," he said. "Not the lights, not the titles, the rhythm, the clarity, the focus. There's something honest about it." He looked down at his hands. "But I wasn't honest with myself. I thought control meant winning. I thought silence meant punishment. But now I know." He looked back at the mirror. "Silence is where the truth lives." Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" Marcus shook his head. "I never left. I just stopped listening." He stood, stretching slowly. "But now I'm hearing everything." The next day, Marcus wrote something on the gym's back wall. It was a quote, simple, unframed, handwritten with a black marker. "Belts fade, titles rust, but character that either grows or it rots." Below it, he signed, "MR." People began to gather around it. Some students wrote reflections beneath it. Others left notes of gratitude. The wall became a mirror of its own, not for ego, for honesty. Brandon took a photo of it one night, posted it on the gym's website with the caption, "A new kind of black belt has joined us. You can't see it, but you can feel it." 1 week later, the gym received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a check, a large one, and a note that simply read, "For the man who reminded me what a fighter really is." Marcus smiled when he read it, then passed it to Lena. "Guess even ghosts leave footprints. Some apologies are just words, others change everything." Brandon stood outside the gym one night. Everyone else had left. The lights were off except for the one in the back room, where Marcus usually cleaned in silence. Brandon held a brown paper bag in his hand. Inside, 2 cups of coffee. He hesitated, then knocked lightly on the back door. Marcus looked up from where he was wiping down the mats. "You bring trouble or peace?" he asked, half smiling. Brandon held up the bag. "Both. Depends how this goes." Marcus nodded and waved him in. They sat on the wooden bench near the locker room. No students, no noise, just the soft hum of the vending machine. Brandon handed him a cup. "It's not fancy," he said. "Gas station coffee, but it's hot." Marcus took a sip, nodded. "Sometimes simple's better." Silence followed, but it wasn't awkward. It was earned. Brandon finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what I was when you showed up here." Marcus waited. "I thought being tough meant being loud," Brandon said. I thought teaching meant proving something every second. He looked at Marcus. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being replaced. Scared of being seen. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Seen how? Brandon exhaled. Like a fraud. His voice cracked slightly. I've worn this black belt for 12 years, but I never really asked myself if I was the kind of man it was supposed to represent. Marcus looked at him. Long and steady. Then maybe now's a good time to start. Brandon nodded. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For the way I treated you. For the way I treated others. For not listening. Marcus didn't respond right away. He took another sip, then said, Do you know what most people get wrong about apologies? Brandon shook his head. They think saying I'm sorry fixes everything. It doesn't. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Real apology isn't a moment, it's a shift. It's who you become after the words. Brandon swallowed hard. Then I've still got a lot of work to do. Marcus looked him in the eye. So do I. The room felt warmer now, like something had been burned off and replaced with light. Brandon stood. I'd like to offer you something. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Brandon continued. Not a position, not a title, just space. He pointed toward the front room. That corner near the quote wall. We want to build a space for reflection, for new students, for old ones who forgot why they started. Call it what you want. He paused. But I was hoping you'd guide it. Marcus stood slowly. Not a class? Brandon shook his head. A compass. Marcus chuckled. That might be the smartest thing you've said all year. They walked out together. No handshake, no ceremony, just two men, no longer competing, but connecting. The next day, a small wooden bench appeared in the gym corner. Above it, a new plaque read, The quiet spot, sit, breathe, remember who you are. Silent storm. 1 month later, Lena found Marcus sitting on the quiet spot bench. He looked at peace. She sat beside him and asked, Do you think people really change? He smiled. I think some forget who they were meant to be, until someone reminds them. It wasn't about the mop anymore. Hadn't been for a while, but Marcus still picked it up every now and then, not because he had to, because it reminded him of where it all began, on the edges, in the quiet, where no one thought to look. The gym had changed. There were still punches, still sweat, still the occasional ego, but now there was also space for silence, for questions, for humility, and for legacy. They called it the quiet spot. But it had become something bigger. New students were drawn to it without knowing why. They'd sit there after class, staring at the quote on the wall. Some would write reflections in the notebook left on the bench. Lena started collecting them. One page read, I came here to learn how to fight, but I'm learning how to stop running instead. Another said, he never raised his voice, but I heard him louder than anyone. And one more, I used to think black belts meant strength. Now I know it means knowing when not to use it. Marcus read those notes quietly one evening, alone. He closed the notebook, looked around the gym. It was still just mats and walls, but something in the air had shifted. It felt less like a ring, more like a refuge. Lena walked in, holding 2 cups of tea. I figured coffee's too loud for a night like this, she said. Marcus chuckled, accepting a cup. You're not wrong. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Lena said, some of the students were asking if you'd ever consider teaching full-time. Marcus shook his head gently. No, I've taught enough with my hands. Now it's time to teach with presence. She nodded. I get that. Then asked quietly, so what now? Marcus leaned back against the wall. I think now I disappear again, but not to hide, to make space. Lena looked confused. He smiled. This place doesn't need me forever. It just needed me to remind it what it already was. That week, Marcus handed the mop to Isaiah. Not because you're being punished, he said, smiling, because I trust you to protect the floor. Isaiah looked confused. Marcus continued, anyone can fight on it, but it takes someone special to honor it. He packed his things in a single duffel bag. No trophies, no gloves, just a photo of Devon, a worn-out belt, and the silence that had become his truest companion. His last night at the gym, no one said goodbye. He didn't want them to. But when he reached the door, Lena was waiting. She didn't hug him, didn't cry. She just handed him a note. On the front, it said, "Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you set in motion." Inside was a quote of his own. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to remind you who you are." Marcus R. And with that, he walked into the night. No spotlight, no final round. Just a man who had once fought to be seen and now found peace in not being noticed. Because sometimes the strongest legacy you can leave is silence. He never raised his voice. He never threw the first punch. And yet, he changed everything, not with fists, but with presence, with silence. Because sometimes the loudest storm is the one that never announces itself. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, drop a word below. Respect. And if you believe voices like his matter, subscribe to Black Voice Matter, because strength is real. But character, that's what echoes.